ncreview.com.
Hello, this is Miriam Knight from New Consciousness Review. I'm speaking with Allan Hunter, the author of Write Your Memoir. It has a very interesting tagline. It says, "The soul work of telling your story." And I would like to ask you, Allan, what do you mean by soul work? Why is writing your memoir soul work?
Oh, I'd be happy to answer that, Miriam. Soul work sounds a little religious, which was not quite what I intended, but I couldn't find another word to describe adequately what it was that happens when we take the time to slow up and look at our own experience and reassess it, because that's what memoir writing is. Many people live lives that are very fast, and they don't know just how much they know, just how much wisdom they have. So, for example, imagine somebody comes to your workplace and you have to explain to them what it is you do, or you have a stranger come into your family and you have to introduce them and explain who everybody is. Suddenly you discover that you know an awful lot of information that perhaps no one else knows in quite the same way. Now, I call that owning your own wisdom. And most of the time, people don't do that. We assume all sorts of things, and we assume that other people know what we do and who we are. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of soul work. For instance, in the book, I refer to one person I worked with for a long time, an incarcerated prisoner. And he said, "I want to write my memoir." And he thought he was going to write a wonderful best-selling book. And, you know, that was not a bad way to look at things. But as we worked together, he started saying things to me like, "Oh, I never told anyone this before." And sometimes he would say, "You know, it's as though I've had several lives and that other person isn't me. And I'm looking back trying to understand who that person is." Well, you know, what he was doing was every day, on every page, he was gradually looking at his life so that he didn't have to repeat the same mistakes he'd made before. If he hadn't been writing his memoir, I don't think he could have got to that place, because it required him to reflect on himself and see himself in a new way, altogether a new way. Now, I make that claim because he's just one example of the many people I've worked with who have, as they've listened to their lives, and I think that's the key element, listening to one's life, they've come to a place of understanding, of peace, and of compassion. And, you know, if that's not soul work, I'm not sure what is. So I could give you many more examples, but that's why I decided the title had to be The Soul Work of Telling Your Story. No one else can do it for you. Only we can do it.
So are you looking at the memoir as something for the individual, that the individual does for him or herself?
Yes, well, that's a really good question. Of course, some people write memoirs for their children and their grandchildren to connect in terms of the information. But I think that whenever we go deep and look at our lives and connect with our inmost selves, then we're bound to connect with other readers, whether they know us or not, because that is where the real essence of our life takes place. You know, it doesn't really matter how many things we did, although that may be very, very entertaining. What matters is what we got from the things we did, whether we were able to deepen our awareness of what it means to be alive. And that, if one does memoir properly, is exactly what happens. And that's why I've kept doing it for 30 years, because I see it changes lives, or causes people to change lives and come to a different place. We move into a new relationship with our own past.
Allan, what's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography?
An autobiography, classically, is the story of one's whole life. So from birth, or possibly, you know, before birth, talking about one's family, until one's last breath, or until, you know, one can no longer hold the pen in one's hand. That's the scope of an autobiography. But a memoir doesn't have to be that big. You see, a memoir can be just a portion of a life. A memoir is composed from a life. So we have Joe Simpson's memoir, wonderful memoir, which describes just 2 days of his life when he fell off a peak in the Andes. That's Touching the Void, a wonderful story. Or the memoir I worked with on my father, he wrote his, with my father, he wrote his whole life story, but the one that we decided to focus on was really the event, the central event of his life, which happened during World War II, when he was shot down and captured and spent 4 years in a prison camp, several prison camps. And that was the moment when his whole life trajectory changed. So I think it's absolutely fine to take a small segment of time like that and say, this is the center of the experience that made me who I am. And it can be 2 days, 2 hours, a couple of years.
Interesting. How does your book actually help the reader with the process of writing the memoir?
Yes, well, I was very specific in this book because it's all very well to tell readers, oh, go ahead and write your story, and then they're left with several pages, and that's when most people give up. And I'm not in the business of encouraging people to do things so they can give up. So throughout this memoir, I give specific directions and exercises and writing prompts. And what I say is, don't think of your memoir as I have to begin here and then move point along. Go to where the energy is. So if you find yourself suddenly remembering, oh, Uncle Bert, wow, then write about Uncle Bert. And don't worry about where Uncle Bert is going to fit in, because he will fit in when you have collected enough short segments. And this is what I call the process of letting the story tell you how it needs to be told. It sounds a little fanciful, but I wouldn't make this claim if it hadn't worked brilliantly well for, well, nearly 30 years when I've been working with people. People find that what comes to the surface in terms of a memory is what has emotional impact. Otherwise, they wouldn't remember it. And when it surfaces, there is a coherence to what your unconscious, your deep memory is trying to let you know. If you say to yourself, oh, this will never make the New York Times bestseller list, you're imposing on your own self an outer standard of judgment that your own self does not want. We don't want you to, I say to my students, I don't want you to write what everybody expects you to write. I want you to write what you feel is necessary to write. And there's a difference.
So you're really writing for yourself?
Absolutely. There is no other person who is worth writing for unless you're writing, a Christmas card. You're writing to express yourself to yourself, to discover, it's often said, writers discover what they mean in the process of writing.
Right. And that gets us back to the soul work element.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it does. So, in the book I give a number of techniques which are all road tested, and they're all very useful. Not all of them will work with every writer, right, but most of them will work most of the time with most writers. And so that's at the center of this very practical little manual that says, you want to do this work? Here's how we set about it. Don't let anyone put you off. Settle into a writing practice, and we can take it from there.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Allan. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight.
Miriam, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
ncreview.com